What's up, guys? This is Chad at All Dogs Off-Road. Today we're going to be working on my Daddy-O's 2019 Nissan Titan. We're going to do a really mild install for him. This truck has the factory suspension and about 60,000 miles on it. We're going to give him a nice little upgrade. What we've got here are some Bilstein 6100s and some 5100 rear shocks. The Bilstein 6100 is quite a bit beefier of a shock than Bilstein's 5100. It's a nice step up, and for full-size applications like the Titan, and then also for the Y62 Armada and the Infiniti QX56 and QX80, one of which we have over there, we like the bigger 6100 shock. It rides quite a bit better. So the plan today is to get the truck up in the air. We're going to strip the suspension out of it. We're going to set the 6100s at the second from bottom notch. This truck has about 1.5 inches of rake from the factory, so we're gonna bring the front up about 1/2 inch. So this is gonna be really mild, not much of a lift, maybe just like a slight level that will still preserve some rake for the vehicle. And we got cam bolts set in there as well, so come along, let's do it. So in this hand is a Bilstein 5100. It's about a 2-inch diameter shock body, and then in my other hand here is the 6100. This is about, I think it converts to about 2.6 inches. So it's got much more oil volume in it and a larger piston. If you have the budget for it, the ride quality is much nicer on a 6100. Like I said, especially on a full-size application. So let's go. I put some PB Blaster on the top hat nuts, the shock bolt, and then the lower control arm cam bolts, just to help break things loose and clean up a little bit of dirt and debris that can bind up the threading. So next step was we're gonna get the lower shock mount disconnected and the top hats. We may have to undo the tie rod here to get things to swing out of the way and give us enough room to work. We'll see here in a minute. The lower shock bolt is going to be a 19 millimeter and the uppers are 14 millimeter. Actually, no, we'll have to disconnect the tie rod. Okay. The outer tie rod has a 22 millimeter bolt, so we're gonna loosen that about all the way up, and then we'll still keep the bolt on there, and we'll use a hammer to pop the tie rod loose. So there's not enough clearance to fish the coilover out by itself. We had to disconnect the outer tie rod. So like I said, 22 mil, a couple whacks on the hammer, and that's all free, and then the coilover just comes right out. We're gonna do the exact same thing on the other side so that we can show you how to do your disassembly, because we're gonna be reusing the factory coil, and then also show you how to set up the Bilstein 6100s. Now that our coilovers are out, we're going to take them over to the spring compressor and we're going to break these down and transfer parts. Here in the shop we use a Brannick 7600 spring compressor, which is really nice. But guys, you know, not everyone's going to have one of these. Sometimes you can go to like your local O'Reilly's or Advance and get some spring compressors. Just the one thing you want to be aware of is they're usually used for like automotive coil springs, not really for truck springs. So you might have some issue fitting over the diameter of the coil spring. If that's the case, sometimes a local shop will disassemble and reassemble coilers for you if you bring them down to them. But something like this makes things really nice and easy. Yep. So every once in a while at the shop, you're going to get humbled. Now, shocks like this typically will have a grabbing point here that you hold so that you can use a wrench and then loosen the retaining nut. The holding point happened to snap off, and that's an 8mm. We're going to remove it the destructive way. We're going to cut through the nut, then do our disassembly. One of the perks of living in the Midwest, you get corrosion on your threads, and sometimes things just don't budge. If you're somewhere where they don't salt the roads in the winter, then you will be much more fortunate than us. So there are a few ways you could go about, when you got a stuck bolt like that. You could use a nut splitter, you could use a grinder or a cutoff wheel and chop it. We used a cutoff wheel. We cut down either side of the shaft, and once we got through one side, then we got through the other. We gave it a little tap, and then the shock just fell right out. We're gonna set up our first Bilstein 6100 here. It's got a new hardware kit, and we're gonna do new top hats, isolators. We use the Beck Arnley 101-8357. We usually pick them up for Rock Auto pretty inexpensively. That part number is only going to be your top hat and isolator. It doesn't include the bushings. So we use a KYB part number for the bushings, and that is the SM5700. Now on the 6100, we're only going for just a little bit of leveling action, but we're not working for dead level. So your bottom setting is basically 0. Your next step up is going to be 0.4 inches, if I remember correctly, and then up from that is 0.7, and then so on. 6100s will come with instructions. The instructions on the 6100s, and also this applies to 5100s, only apply with your OEM factory coil. If you're going to be doing a lift with one of our ADO coils, the lift is already built into the coil spring. So when you're using an All Dogs lift coil, you have to keep your snap ring at the bottom setting. Otherwise, what will just end up happening is you'll be putting too much preload on the shock, and you'll probably damage or break the shock in half. So when you're doing these assemblies, follow the Bilstein instructions when you're using a factory coil. If you're using an aftermarket lift coil like the ones that we produce, disregard the Bilstein instructions, keep your snap ring at the bottom. On 5100s, moving the snap ring is pretty easy. The 6100s, the snap ring is a little bit beefier, so it can be a little bit more of a struggle. You use some pliers. I have some vice grips here. You basically just grab on, stretch your snap ring slightly, and then shimmy it into the position that you want. The 6100s, these snap rings are kind of like a heat-treated spring steel. So you want to really be careful not to bend them or distort them. I mean, you're gonna have to be a little bit aggressive with them, but be as gentle as you can so that you don't deform or destroy them. Your coil spring perch goes right on it. Now, make absolute certain that your snap ring is fully seated in the groove. Again, if you're not seated in the groove, you run the risk of the snap ring just kind of flying off and then damaging the snap ring or the shock. So before you do your assembly, make sure that everything is really in place. Now, I believe the Bilstein instructions, they come with a new washer and a nut. We are actually not going to use that washer because they salt the roads here. We're going to just slide it right on, and that's going to be our lower starting point. So we've got all our new hardware here, new top hat, new isolator, and then our bushing kit all unboxed. We run into a lot of confusion with the assembly here, both from shops and from DIYers alike. Really, this is simple. All you're doing is making a metal washer and rubber bushing sandwich. So if you were to be starting with your shock completely bare, you start with your lower washer, and this boot has a washer built into it. So that's going to be our starting point. That's the bread. That's your bottom of your sandwich. Then you're going to be doing a rubber bushing, And these have a groove on one side, and that groove seats into the top hat. So that'll be your rubber there. Then you do your top hat and isolator, and then you have a metal sleeve on Nissans that runs down the center. Then you do your other rubber bushing. Again, it's got a groove on it, and that's gonna go into your top hat. And then your washer, and then the nut. And if you want to think about it visually, you know, as your shock cycles up and down, your rubber is insulating your top hat here. So you got rubber up top for when your shock unloads. You got rubber under here for when your shock compresses, and all of that works with the shock to dampen the vehicle, and then also your rubber reduces NVH. So lower washer, lower rubber, top hat, sleeve, upper rubber, upper washer, then nut. So we're ready to start assembly. Everything is good to go. We're gonna compress the spring here. We'll fish the shock up through, get our bushing and washer assembly in place, and then we will tighten the shock down. Now, standard practice is to line up the point of your shock with your pigtail. On a Titan, pigtail would be, you got a dot on your top hat here, because your two fronts, this is basically the front of the shock, so you can line up like that. That orientation really is more important on a factory shock because your lower spring perch is welded to the shock body. With something like a 5100 or a 6100, it spins freely, so the orientation doesn't really matter so much. From like a coil standpoint, you really just need to line up your triangle with your lower eyelet, just so that everything lines up and bolts in when you go to put it in the vehicle. Now on Bilstein 5100s and 6100s, they just cut two slots, and it's you really just use like a crescent wrench, and the nut is an 18 millimeter. So once everything's in place, just tighten it down until it bottoms out. So our first coilover is done. Now we're just going to rinse and repeat for the second. Hopefully we don't run into the same situation and that the nut comes off without having to cut through. Well, after a little bit of grief, we got our coilovers assembled, so now we're gonna throw them in the truck. You got a triangle pattern, and it's gonna point in toward the engine, and then your eyelet is gonna line up with your lower control arm. So this should be relatively painless. Assembly is just going to be a reverse of disassembly. So coilovers in, going to put the shock bolt in, reconnect your tie rod, torque everything up, and then this side will be done, then we'll do the other side. So now we got everything in place and we're tightening up. Top hat nuts, I think are like 33 foot-pound. We usually just hand tighten them. We don't torque spec them. Lower shock bolt, we usually do, it's 90 foot-pound if I remember correctly, but we do a 100 foot-pound torque stick. And then your tie rods, if I remember correctly, are I think 65 foot-pound, but you probably want to double check that. We're gonna finish buttoning up the front and then we'll move to the back. One thing I forgot to mention is the camber bolts. So whenever you do any sort of lift, you need to install adjustable cam bolts. Nissan from the factory sends non-adjustable bolts. And so we've loosened all the nuts on the cam bolts on these lower control arms, and at the moment it appears that the cam bolts are seized in place. So we may have to cut these control arms out and replace them so that we can install adjustable cam bolts and get our alignment into spec. Alright guys, we're at front suspension round 2. Cam bolts are seized, and what that means is that control arms are going to have to be cut out and replaced so that we can install adjustable cam bolts. The sway bar end links, the threads were galled on them, so we cut the end links and we're going to replace those. So the sway bar is pushed out of the way. We will loosen the bolt that holds the lower control arm ball joint, extract those, and then we'll be doing some chopping. So when we cut out lower control arms, we'd like to do a little bit of a combo deal. We'll use a Sawzall to cut through the arms themselves to give us room, and then we have a large 8-inch cutoff wheel, and we use that to rip through the cam bolts. Sometimes the bushing sleeves in these control arms are hardened steel, so a Sawzall blade is pretty slow to cut them out. But when you do all this, usually the wheel will slice through like butter. Now your lower control arm ball joint has like a retaining bolt. It's a 19 mil nut and then a 17 mil or 18 mil on this side. So you take your nut off, and then with an impact you can work this left and right, and then eventually you'll be able to pound it out, and then you should be able to get the control arm out of place. So we got our passenger side control arm all chopped out. It's been a bit of work. We're about to put the new lower control arm in. Typically, you have to loosen your CV. You don't have to pull it all the way, but you got to give yourself enough room to work, because the inner of the CV will interfere with your ball joint, either taking it out or even putting it in. So you got to loosen your CV nut so that you've got that room to play with. When you go to do your lower control arm installation, pay it forward and put some anti-seize on your cam bolts. You really just want it on the shank, don't get it on your thread. I've got a couple cam bolts anti-seized up, and we'll put the control arm in, put the cam bolts in, swing it up, and then insert the ball joint. Or actually, I'm sorry, the vice versa of that. The ball joint will go in first, and then we'll swing everything over and then put the cam bolts in. Sorry, I had that backwards. We'll get her done. So the front is all buttoned up. We've got the cam bolts in and lightly tightened. Everything else is torqued to spec and ready to go. You don't want to fully tighten the cam bolts until you have the weight of the vehicle on the ground, because you're setting your lower control arm bushing position. Now the front is 99% done, we'll go and throw the rear shocks in, and then this will be it. So your bolt here is a 21 and the nut is a 19. Up top, 21 as well. So should be pretty quick and easy. So the second gens are just like the first gens. There's a bolt that runs through the shock mount at the upper part there. There's a plastic trim piece with some clips, and then there's also a wiring harness there right in the way of you being able to get a 19 mil in with an extension to be able to get on it. So you'll have to remove the clips, push the trim piece out of the way, and disconnect or pull the plastic clip for the wiring harness, and that should give you enough access on the driver's side. I think the passenger side is just the clips. I don't think there's wiring harness over there. So shocks are installed front and rear. Everything is torqued with the exception of lower control arm cam bolts. We'll do that off video when we set the vehicle on the ground. This will have new tires put on it tomorrow and alignment, and we'll do some follow-up pictures or like a final video at the end here. We're really excited. It's going to look fantastic, and it's going to ride 10 times better than it did with the factory twin tube shocks. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments, like, subscribe, and stick around for more videos.